All right, today we're going to start our lesson on graphing sine and cosine curve, but before we get into the graphing, which will be the next lesson, not today's, we need some key terms and some features that will help us graph. And that is on amplitude and period. We'll come back to this graph in a second. This is a standard sine curve. It's easy to tell because it passes through the origin. We're not doing any shifts right or left. So this is just a sine curve. It starts at the origin. Our basic equation for sine or cosine curve is in this form, or standard form, y equals a times sine of bx, or y equals a times cosine of bx. Very, very important things to start with is, number one, the amplitude, which is just the absolute value of the number in here. Remember, on a quadratic or square root or any of those, that number in front is a vertical stretch or compression. If it's bigger than 1, it's a stretch. Less than 1, it's a compression. If it's negative, it's a reflection. So that just represents basically the stretch. And amplitude is the distance from midline to the maximum or minimum point. That's very important, from the midline. It's not always from the x-axis. In this case, it is, because the midline is the x-axis, so it cuts it right in half. But because it's a distance, it's always absolute value. And then the other term is called our period. And to find the period is just 2 pi divided by the absolute value of the b, the number in front of this x, or sometimes we use theta. And that's just the distance required to complete one full cycle. And the period for sine and cosine is 2 pi. So finish. What does that mean? Well, if you look at this, from here to here, I'm finished because a half a circle there, there's another half. These two together make a full circle. And how long did it take to finish that? 2 pi. Okay, 2 pi to finish that whole circle or cycle. All right, so what I want to start with is just finding the amplitude and period of each function. Remember, the amplitude is always positive. It's the absolute value of the coefficient of the sine or cosine. So in this case, the amplitude is just 3. It has a vertical stretch of 3. And the period, the formula is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. So all I need to do is replace the b in this problem with 2. So the period is pi. That means it'll finish an entire cycle or full circle by the time it reaches pi. This next one, the coefficient of the cosine is -1, but remember the amplitude is always the absolute value because it's just a distance. So the amplitude is 1. And we'll spend a lot more time on that on the next lesson when we use this to graph, but I'll show you some pictures in a second. And the period, again, 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b, which would be 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. So I will finish one complete cycle by the time I reach pi over 2, which what it does is changes these units, because this very last one would be pi over 2. Half of that would be pi over 4, so the units would be pi over 8, 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8. That's not that important for now. I'm not going to worry about that. All right, now for a really difficult one because it has fractions. Oh no. All right, the amplitude again is the distance from the midline to the maximum or minimum point on the graph. Well, that's just the absolute value of that coefficient of the sine. This one would be a compression. Think of this as somebody squeezing this together. It'd be closer to the x-axis. Now, one thing that's important, the amplitude, if you double that, that's how far it is from the lowest point to the highest point. So from here to here, notice it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4. But the amplitude is half of that. So if you can count from lowest to highest, just take half of that. All right, so that one was, this one, part of it is easy. It's the absolute value of the coefficient. The period's a little harder because we have a fraction I'm going to rewrite it because we have a fraction. I'm going to rewrite it like this. 2 pi divided by 1/3. And if you go way back to 3rd or 4th grade, remember, keep, change, flip. So this one would be 6 pi is the period. It takes all the way to 6 pi to finish one complete cycle or circle. All right, so that is amplitude and period. We're going to do the same thing on these, but we're also now going to write the equation. Now, one thing I want you to notice, and I mentioned this a while ago, is how you can tell the difference between a sine and cosine if there is no shift. We call that a phase shift in trig. But if there's no shift right or left, if it goes through the origin, it's a sine curve. If it doesn't go through the origin, be careful, this one is shifted down. There's no horizontal shift. But this one doesn't go through the origin. This is a cosine curve. Now the amplitude, again, is the distance from the midline to the highest or lowest point, or you could take the lowest point to the highest point and then take half of that. But on this problem, and most of them, I'm just going to take this, what we call, again, the midline. It's what cuts it in half. Now, it's not always the x-axis, so be careful, but the distance from here to the highest point is 2. Now, how do you know if it's positive or negative? Well, for a sine curve, the point to the right of the origin, if it's up, it's positive. If it's down here, it's negative. I'll get to the cosine. This one's a cosine. We'll get to that in a second. So the amplitude is 2, because the distance from lowest to highest is 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 units. Half of that is 2. The period, I'm going to write down the formula, 2 pi over the absolute value of b. But I know in this case, if you look at these units, 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. It finishes right here. How do I know it finishes? Notice it starts at 0, going up. Well, it goes through 0 here, but it didn't finish the complete circle. It didn't finish until here. So I know this is equal to pi. That's the formula, 2 pi over b, and I know it equals pi. So if I solve this for b, just cross multiply, I'm going to take out that absolute value. 2 pi equals pi b. If I divide by pi, I get just plain old 2. All right, so that's my b value. Remember these equations, this one's sine, y equals a times sine of bx. Okay, I knew my period was pi. This I used to find b. Okay, period is pi. That took that long. So what's my equation? Y equals a, which is my amplitude, times sine, because it went through the origin. B value here is 2, so b of 2x. There's my equation. All right, now this one again, it doesn't go through the origin. There is a shift, but it's not horizontal. It's a shift down. I'm going to try and find the midline. Where's the midline? Well, from lowest point to highest point is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Half of 6 is 3. So here's my midline. And how far is it from that midline to this maximum? 1, 2, 3. The amplitude's 3. The period, let's figure out these units. They're each pi, so that'd be 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. So my period, or let's see, it started here down here. Where does it get back there? Right here at 4 pi. That's my period. I should have just wrote my period over here as just pi. Now use that to find your b value, because I know the period is equal to 2 pi over the absolute value of b. If I cross multiply, I'm just going to take out that absolute value. 4 pi times b equals 2 pi. And if I divide by 4 pi, I get b is equal to a half. So my equation then, again, I know it's a cosine, and this is y equals a times cosine of bx. My a is 3, but because it starts down here, it's a reflection of the cosine. Okay? If it starts below the midline, it's a reflection, so this is y equals negative 3. Again, it's cosine because it doesn't go through the origin. I'd call this my new origin. B is 1/2 of x. So that's the equation. I found the amplitude because it's the distance to the highest point, or the lowest, 1, 2, 3, same thing. The period, how long did it take to finish that circle? Took to 4 pi to finish. That's my period. And I used that to figure out my b. All right, there you go. Hopefully that'll help you get through the homework. Have a wonderful day.